Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thanks very much. And very nice to be here, folks. As John mentioned, he and I have done one of these presentations before. I am a career coach with the Professional Support Unit, which many of you may know of. And one thing I would like to do today is just talk to you a little bit about the resources they provide. So I think you could find that very helpful. I'm also going to share some slides. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on these, but I think you've received some from me already around resources. Very happy to share today's slides, so you don't need to sit and take notes if you felt like it. They'll be coming your way. So that's how we'll do this. So let me just, I'm just going to run through a few things with you. Yeah, so just really kind of focusing, first of all, on you. I mean, John just raised the question, how do you stand out? And that first question, as he said, is very much about, what do you bring? That can be as sort of broad and general as you wish. One thing I'd like to talk to you about today, and by the way, please do chat away if you have any questions and I'm ignoring you, which is sometimes the case. Please do also shout out. I think we can all access audio on here, so no need to stay on mute if you do have a question or you want to interrupt me at any point. So this is really about, how do you stand out at interview? And what can you do to prepare effectively? John's spoken a little bit about that. I'm going to say a bit more about it. And also, as I said, share some resources with you. So yes, obviously nobody wants to be one penguin in a whole, I'm not actually sure what the collective noun is, but probably flock or something like that. So what do you need to do to really kind of get attention and to draw attention to what you bring? So just briefly, before I go into kind of more on that, I just want to share this with you. It's something that you may be familiar with. The Professional Support Unit runs a whole range of courses, and I just do encourage you to have a look there. They do one on preparing for consultants interview success. As you can see, it's a freebie and they run very frequently. They are pretty booked up, but just to say, here are some of the things you might want to think about in general with regard to the PSU. If you want to access that particular training event, please do go on the website. I'm just running through some other resources with you here. And if you have an interview coming up shortly, I don't know sort of how far off some of you folks are, but if it's fairly imminent, you can also access one-to-one support if you're not able to get onto one of the training workshops. So those are just some of the resources on offer, and I hope you'll find them useful. Please do take a look. I'm not going to go into all of that in detail, but you can see it all on the website, and there is the link there. Yeah, so if you do go to the PSU session, this is what you can expect in terms of preparing for a consultant interview. Here are some of the things it brings. So it does give a career structure, a structured way of looking at career and applying it to yourself, your own particular needs and so on. I guess this point about networking, what are the groups, who are the people you want to have around you in order to move towards success, in order to make the best of those kind of meetings you have. Sometimes afterwards we think, I wish I'd really thought more about that or asked this question. So, how to make the most of those particular kinds of occasions. Part of it is also about practicing your interviewing skills. And I'm not going to talk about that a great deal today, but I'm just going to touch on one or two things you might like to think more about there, and looking at the tasks that you need to start carrying out in the near future in order to prepare. And it is a kind of preparation journey. So that's what you'll get from the PSU session, and I hope many of you will have the chance to access it. Before kind of looking at questions in a bit more depth and thinking about each of you individually and what you bring, there's a couple of, let's call them theoretical models, I suppose, for want of a better term. Here is one of them, and again, you can access this from the PSU. So the RHODES acronym just really gets you thinking quite broadly at your career in general, and it's a pretty useful starting point when you're preparing for interview, because questions do come up about kind of what is your motivation, those kinds of questions. What do you most want to achieve, looking ahead, etc. Where do you see yourself taking the department and so on. Here is just a bit more on that acronym. So, when you're applying for a job, are you being realistic about yourself, what you bring, and the post? Is it really kind of giving you what you need? Of course, those questions do come up for all of us, but maybe just making sure you think about that in some detail. And if you want it, what is it about it particularly that appeals to you? Are there other opportunities, other options out there for you? You know, have you really factored in what is important for you? And there could be a whole range of things here. So, you know, this might be about, is it something that's going to suit you in terms of your personal life, in terms of your particular ambitions, logistics, all of that, of course, comes in. And you know best what those headings are. So, you know, is this going to fulfill what you want? And these are questions that we don't always ask ourselves until kind of after the interview, or maybe only in preparation for the interview, but really kind of looking at, you know, what do you see as your particular development goals, your career goals at this point, having something in mind about that. And there is that point also about stress. You know, what aspects of the role might you find challenging? This is not necessarily obviously something to bring up at interview, but really to think about, how is this going to fit in with my life in general? These aren't the kind of questions people typically ask themselves, but a good thing to think about, because, you know, it really is going to matter to you. So that's just one way of looking at it. I won't go into detail on this one, but you can just see there's a kind of career planning framework there using the acronym SCAN, which you might find helpful. So just starting from a point of self-awareness, you know, what do you bring? What kind of doctor? So you can see the question there, do you want to be? And then looking more deeply. So I'm just introducing these as a kind of way of thinking about the consultant interview in a broader context. It's not just about preparing for the interview itself, but also just really thinking about, you know, where would you like this to take you? What are your particular interests? What can you speak about with passion at interview? What do you need, you know, people to know about your motivation and so on? So let's leave that there for now. I really want to kind of put a question to you. So here it is. John talked a bit about some questions just now. I'm just wondering if you would just take a look at what's on the screen there. What do you think is the question at consultant interview that people most dread being asked? And if you can just write it in chat, there is a kind of fairly common one, which we hear about regularly. This is the most dreaded one. What do you think it might be? Which of all the questions that one could be asked do you think might be the most dreaded? If you want to just put it in chat, let's have a look at some of what's appearing there. So thank you. I'm seeing, what is your USP? Yep. Your weaknesses? Yep. What about a mistake you've made? Tell us about a mistake you've made. I think John's have touched on that kind of question just now. Why do you think this job is for you? So you can see what's appearing there. What makes you right for this? Somebody said, I find the simplest question the hardest. Take me through your career and the highlights so far, all in 5 minutes. Yes, I can relate to that one. Why should we choose you? Yeah. Has anyone got any that we haven't seen there in chat? You're fairly in agreement with what we've got there. So quite a few of you said, you know, what makes you right for the job, or what is your least appealing quality? What are your weaknesses? Tell us about a mistake you've made. Yeah, it is actually, well, in our experience, who knows? Because of course there have been many interviews. That point about that question about what is your weakness, what is your your biggest challenge, can be one of the most dreaded to answer. So I'm going to ask you to think about that one a bit. And again, in chat, if you would, let's just have a little reflection on that. What would be, let's think about perhaps 1 or 2 ways in which you would not answer that question. What would be the worst way to answer that question? So let's have some reflections on that. Anybody know what you would not say in answer to the question? What are your weaknesses? Maybe, I don't know, if some of you have done some interview practice and had this question come up, or okay, I don't have any weaknesses. Yes, absolutely. I'm really slapdash and disorganized, and not to answer the question, to dodge it. Yes, thank you. Great stuff. So one of the things that isn't required is for you to give a long list of your weaknesses. Of course, that does show self-awareness. However, as we can easily imagine, very, very off-putting to be on the panel and hear that, to hear a long kind of list of what isn't great about you. Does anyone have any tips on how you might answer this question? What could be some good, just initial starting points to answer this particular question? Anybody want to, please do feel free to shout out, by the way, if you want to turn your mic on, or just to write in chat. Okay, so a few more comments there. What would be one way to answer this effectively? Shout out, write, whatever comes to mind. I'm hoping we can share your chat tips. I was asking Katie about this earlier afterwards. Okay, so yep. So Sarah said my memory is not the best, so I set myself reminders. Just showing how you manage a particular challenge, how you've turned a weakness into a positive, how you overcame it. Thank you, Sonia. A couple of you have said that actually. So that is a really good point. One thing not to do, as some of you have said, is to dodge the question and not answer it, because it can be a bit of a blow if you haven't prepared that one. It comes up very frequently in different guises, by the way. So not to dodge it, you do need to find something. And I think John touched on this earlier. Some of you have said something about this now, really to show your self-awareness and to think about, okay, so here is a weakness, here's something that's come up. You might want to give a specific example of it, talk about what you did in a particular situation when this came up and what you've learned from it. So again, we have that whole kind of reflective process of, yes, here's something I get feedback on, I'm aware of it, here's what I'm doing about it, and some of the progress you've maybe already made. There kind of needs to be a whole story. And the best point to end on, of course, is the result. As a result of taking this action, I now, etc. And you can apply that kind of response to any kind of question that relates to a challenge, that relates to something that went wrong. I think you used the kind of team example earlier, John. So bringing a kind of negative story to a positive ending, if you like, or positive outcome. Really strong way to do it. This may all seem like blindingly obvious. Sitting here now, the thing is, this question comes up in different guises. So we really need to think about, okay, what kind of question is this? If you haven't prepared an answer, it can be all too easy just to kind of give an example, but not say what you now do about it. So it's that piece about self-learning, you know, your own reflection and managing to kind of move on and improve on it. So, okay. That is the question that's most commonly asked. I don't know if you all, maybe that's one that you would say is your most dreaded question, but if it isn't, what I'd like you to do now is just, if you've got a pen and paper or something you can discreetly write on, please do. What is the question that you personally, you individually would most dread being asked at interview? And just take a minute or two to have a think about that. It may be what we've just spoken about, or it may be something else. What is it? What would you least like to be asked at interview? And you don't need to put it in chat, incidentally, but if you have a pen and paper there, perhaps write it down on that. If you do fancy putting it in chat, please do, but you know, no need. So just take a few seconds, a few moments to think about that. We've all had an interview at some point where this kind of question has come up. So if you've written it down, let me ask you if anyone is willing to share it. Just either to say it aloud or write it in chat. Question you would most dread being asked. And I'm hearing, thank you. I'm going to say resounding silence, but yes, thank you. So, sorry, let me come back. Where do you see yourself in 6 months, 1 year, 5, 10 years? From Adam. Thank you, Adam. Would you mind just telling us a bit about why that for you is a dreaded question, if you're willing to share? If you can get on, turn your mic on, that would be brilliant, or write it in chat, whichever you feel like doing. So that question about looking ahead, where do you see yourself? And if anyone else agrees that that's also one they wouldn't like to be asked, please do feel free to, I don't know if we can raise hands here actually, but say so in chat. So yes, okay, thanks Adam. It feels a bit nebulous. All right, so much can happen in one's life, absolutely. How many of us actually do look ahead that far? And you also said, Adam, make it into a succinct answer seems hard. Yeah, so again, that's a very good example of a question that we often forget to prepare. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute about what does happen when people prepare for interviews. It may not apply to all of you by any means. We tend to focus on certain kinds of question. and therefore kind of come in really ready to answer those. We all have questions we least like answering, so maybe those are the ones to kind of look at. Adam, sorry, Sarah, you just made a comment, thank you, in response to Adam's most dreaded question. I think they're really asking, will you be here and what will you do for us? Very good point. Almost every question you get is obviously about you and what you bring, but it's also that bottom line of what can you do for us? Where do you add value? What makes you stand out? Coming back to that question that John raised, what makes you different? What makes you special? So it all has to come back to that context of what can you do here? It's not about, well, actually, I've always wanted to pursue a career as a screenwriter or something. I can't think of any examples, but yeah, of course you may well, but this is about what do you want to do for the organisation, and of course that also comes back to what do you know about them, what do you know about what they want, and that's about your research and interest in general. Thank you very much for sharing that. Let's just have a quick look at some question types, because I think you would have received yesterday, I'm hoping you have, and please do shout if you haven't. I sent round for circulation a list of sample interview questions, and there's a massive list there. I don't know if it was daunting or you're fairly familiar with all of them. The reason that I did that is because they do regularly come up, what you see there, and some of them are fairly grim actually, difficult to answer. Some of those will come up. So let's look at them in terms of types. It's a nice way to do it. We're never going to be able to prepare for every question, of course, and it's really helpful just to have some kind of framework in mind of, okay, what kind of question is that? What are they looking for? What's wanted here? And not necessarily to go with your first response, because if you haven't prepared, you need to think quite broadly. So here we go. So the kind of question about understanding, you know, what are the essential elements of? That's one kind of question that might relate to the organisation. You know, what do you know about them? What do you know about policy in general, and so on? It's a kind of knowledge-related question. How would you describe yourself? I think someone just said earlier, you know, this is one of the worst to be asked in a way, because that talk me through your CV, or talk me through your application form, or talk me through the highlights of your life. You really do need to have something in mind that can be delivered fairly succinctly, but also compellingly. So that kind of question, tell us about you. Very general, very broad, can be quite tough. Yeah, so scenario ethical questions. What would you do if? These very typically do come up. And there's something here about, it's, you know, obviously it's an element of knowledge. It's also about your own personal take on things, professional ethics and so on. So being aware again of what's required there. These are kind of typical categories, as I said. Describe a situation when you, again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a kind of story in this. So what was the situation? What was the challenge in that? What did you do? What was the outcome? There's a kind of acronym, and I'll share some of that with you in a second. I'm hoping I'm not running drastically over time, but just to have a look at a few acronyms that can work in terms of answering these questions. So it's not just about describing the situation, it is talking about, of course, the action you took and what happened as a result, and also any learnings you took from it. So if you can kind of keep that framework in mind, it can be really helpful. Yeah, tell me about your experience of, again, practical examples, a story, something that has a kind of positive outcome and so on. What do you know about as well? And the motivation questions, anybody have any thoughts about what that relates to? What appeals to you most about? Any ideas, if you want to put them in chat, what kind of aspects of your professional self, if you like, does that relate to when you're asked what appeals to you most about? Or feel free to shout out as you wish. Any thoughts? Has anyone been asked that kind of question? Subspecialty, okay, yes. Looking further, yeah, what is it? What are the kind of specifics here for you? Where would you like to take this? What particular directions and so on? Okay, anything else? Anyone else? Okay, yes, people do want to know what are your specific areas of interest, and in some ways it kind of relates to that question going forward. You know, what do you see particularly developing? What are you wanting to take ahead? And that, as I said, that does come back to what your organisation wants, what the trust wants. Let's actually have a look at some acronyms now. And And as I said, I haven't got my timer in front of me, so please do someone tell me if I'm droning on. I don't want to do that, but I do want to just share some key points with you. You can't predict questions, as that list perhaps that you've received shows. There are a huge number you could potentially be asked. What it does help to know is what kind of category of question is this? What does it fall into? And what do I need to show here? So I'm just going to whiz through these a little bit. We talked about them just now. The understanding questions, I think you can see with all of these what you need to think about. Self-description in particular, really that point about being able to reflect on your experience and learn from it. It's not just what you did, what you took from it, what you understood. Being able to listen to feedback, obviously a key thing as well. Yeah, so scenarios, really having some good stories, some examples to hand so you can illustrate a particular point and show the kind of evidence, show the outcome and so on. Behaviour skills, that's a very key area of question. You need to be able to talk about specific things, specific actions, and your own abilities and competencies with regard to that. Okay, yeah, so experience. When you think about your experience, it may also be kind of witnessing what other people have done and what you learned from it in particular situations. That's also a very valid part of experience. The motivation bit I asked you about just now, let's just have a look at some acronyms, which very simple. You may have come across them before. Really helpful to kind of keep that framework in mind. If you're feeling nervous at an interview, the very broad questions can sometimes catch us out, but if you've got a kind of structure in mind, it can be really helpful just to kind of keep with that and think about what you need to talk about. So I'm going to just show you a few of these. CAMP, okay, so as you can see, it's an acronym. Here are the key points that relate to it. So that is about, why did you apply for this? It might have to do with your clinical interests and expertise. Some of you talked about subspecialty interests. It might be to do with your academic interests, what you're interested in researching, etc. You can see the headings there. Leadership management, very key part of it too. And personally, we tend to go a little bit too far at times towards the professional and forget about, we are human beings, of course, and your interviewers do kind of want to know, will they get on with you? That is a key thing which people may forget, and it's very much a part of it. So what do you do outside work? It's very helpful to have something to talk about, because we are not all professionals the whole time. Again, may seem very obvious. When you're actually in an interview, we tend to forget about that stuff. So that's one way to look at motivation questions. This kind of question very often comes up. How do you deal with difficult colleagues? How do you deal with ethical questions? When maybe it's quite a tough choice to be made. I don't know if anybody has an example of that you might want to share. If you've been asked a question like this, any particular examples come to mind? If so, feel free to say them or pop them in chat. It could be a kind of example where you have a kind of clash of policy and principle vis-a-vis a relationship you've got with a colleague. So where there's some difficult choices to be made, those things do come up. So you can see again how that acronym works. And the key point is you do want to talk about all those aspects of it. What is your thinking in making the choice you made? Very important to emphasize. How did you support the particular individual or the team? Also very significant. So that acronym again can be very useful for this kind of question. All right, and finally, so examples, they're key. Quite often what people do under pressure, if you're not feeling fully prepared, is really just to kind of think, all right, so I know I can do this, I know I can do that, and list the sort of skills that they feel are required, the areas of knowledge or interest. You do need to back it up. Again, seems obvious, but we tend to forget. Have some stories to hand which show a positive outcome, show your learning, show where that took you in your development. The reflection piece is really key in all of this. How am I doing? Anybody got any questions at this stage? I feel like I'm possibly talking too much. Please do write them in chat, or as I said, if you want to pop them on audio. Yes, turn your mics off is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so just keeping going. I just invite you to think about this in the broadest sense. When you think about what you bring to interview as a professional, it really does help to look pretty broadly. This again is a framework that the PSU use in their workshop. Looking beyond strengths, of course we need to focus on strengths and think about what you do particularly well, but also look at what are your areas of interest. It could be obviously in work. You might want to think about a couple of things you enjoy doing outside work. That question does come up sometimes. What stresses you? And if you know that, then you also need to have a story about it and how you deal with it now. And that's likely to be a key question. It might present in other ways, what do you find challenging and so on, but it may be about how do you manage stress? How do you deal with it? The values bits, really important, and quite often we forget to talk about that. So that question about what appeals to you most, why do you want this job? Somebody said in chat that's one of the ones you find difficult, you kind of dread. And yeah, thinking about what you care about, what motivates you, what kind of gets you out of bed in the morning. I mean, there may be all kinds of things, but professionally, what really matters? And it's easy to make a statement about it, but thinking about how that shows in your professional behaviour, maybe have an example or two. Really important to kind of think about this broadly when you prepare for interview in terms of what you bring. These are things that could be assessed. They could come up in questions in different ways. Okay, so we've talked a fair bit about questions. Here's the thing, you can prepare for questions, and you really need to, of course, and look out for certain kinds of question and so on. But you also really need to think about if you only had a few minutes. This is the kind of classic elevator pitch, as they say in the States. If you only had a few minutes to tell your interview panel the most important things about you, it could be your values, it could be your strengths, it could be how you deal with certain challenges and so on. What would you want them to know? And I would say that's a really key thing in preparing for interview, so that you know that you've conveyed that message, whatever the questions were. Really have that in mind. And you might even want to, if you're doing a bit of prep around this, prepare it as a tweet, so that you've got something incredibly succinct. And obviously you would never share it in that way in the interview. But sometimes it's a really good way to think about the question about, kind of who are you and what do you bring? Why should we employ you? Somebody had as their most dreaded question. This is the piece. Okay, here's what I bring. And there are different ways to get that across. Quite tough, but just really having the kind of core message there helps you to be succinct on it and also illustrate it further when you need to. So that would be a key tip. I really just want to spend a little bit of time also just talking, if I may, about working virtually. John has said something about that. We've thought about meetings on Teams. It does help to have some kind of basics in place, and obviously virtual is kind of the name of the game at the moment. How do we do this? I work virtually the whole time, and I've been doing this for many years actually. And thankfully also get out to the old face-to-face meeting. The various things I've noticed, particularly, I have to say, during the last few months, as we now are doing more and more virtual meetings, if not entirely, some things matter more than ever before. And I'm going to share a few with you, see what you think. It tends to vary according to our own personality preference. If you're an introvert, then you may not enjoy being on webcam particularly, and being on an interview in the virtual setting. And of course, people who are much more expressive may really quite enjoy doing presentations. That's a bit of a kind of cliched way to look at it, but it will make a difference what your own personality preferences are. Here are some things that do turn out to matter even more in virtual space when you're having a virtual interview. So let me just run through those, and then I will fortunately stop talking. So here are some tactics. I'm going to share these slides with you, as I mentioned. And if anybody wants to say, hang on a minute, I don't agree, or here's a better tip, please do. The invitation's there, either speak or write in chat, whatever you'd like. I'm not going to speak to them. I'm just going to put them up so that you can see them. And maybe I'll just point out one or two of the ones that get the most forgotten. Sometimes, if we feel we're making a mess of the question, it really does help to say, let me just come back on that. Perhaps I can just have another shot at answering that. It's okay. We probably wouldn't want to do it every single time, but sometimes it's necessary, and why not? If we haven't got a structure in mind, it can be a long ramble, and in virtual space that tends to look even more obvious. So keeping some kind of framework for how you'd answer a certain kind of question really helps, even if it's just bullet points. Yeah. And if you don't understand what the question's really getting at, it's not just what it sounds like maybe, but perhaps there's a bit more there, then looking for some clarification. Why not? Don't be afraid to do that. So you can just see some tips appearing there. I think I've already spoken about when in a hole, stop digging. Yeah, nothing worse. Find yourself getting more and more kind of enmeshed in a not very good answer. Just draw a line and start again. Yeah, and that last point about body language, I think really important. We can get quite sort of hung up on it. There are some key things not to do, and I will just go through a few kind of virtual tips, if you like, in a moment. Anybody got any kind of key things not to do when working virtually in a virtual meeting? Perhaps you want to put them in chat. I had some sunflowers. I'm at home today, as you might have gathered, and I had some sunflowers kind of on the edge of the webcam earlier on. I decided to kind of shunt them out of the way because I actually really quite like them. But in an interview, this is a very, very obvious point. You need to have a fairly clean, clear, professional looking background. I don't know if any of you quite like using these ones we can now get where you have the sort of, you know, some kind of San Francisco bridge behind you or a conference suite. It's a bit tricky if obviously it doesn't work well. So kind of keeping it simple, I think, is a really key thing, by the way. The body language piece, and I'm looking at the slide now, I'm not looking at you. It really makes a difference actually to make eye contact, something John referenced as well. If you're reading a script off slide, if you're reading some thoughts you jotted down earlier in the virtual setting, it's really obvious. We tend to glaze over. It doesn't look very compelling. So just kind of keeping that clear, but don't worry too much. If you like to do this with your hands and wave your hands about, it isn't a problem unless you go a bit too far with it. I think when people try and kind of keep themselves, you know, a bit bolted down, that can be actually really quite a constraint. Actually can make life a bit more difficult. You know, we may find our mind goes blank if we're not kind of speaking in the usual kind of way. Anybody got any other tips you'd like to share or add or disagree with what I've got there? Please feel free. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Just a very short bit on presentations. I'm not going to talk about this in depth now, actually, but I will just share this slide with you. There isn't time to do it justice. It's something, as I mentioned, the PSU do offer some further support and training around. You can just see the key points there, and I will leave it there. John also, of course, spoke about it a little bit. So there are the points, and this will come your way. I think if I wanted to highlight just one thing, I would, that last point about tell a story. Virtually everything we say in an interview is some kind of story, to the extent that it has a kind of point and an outcome, which needs to be in your favor and show your understanding, self-awareness, and so on. It really is important to keep that in mind when you're doing a presentation so that it feels personal, much more compelling that way. Okay, 6 quick tips. Here they go. So this is all about working virtually, managing virtual interviews. We've all been doing a lot of virtual meetings, of course, in the last few months. Some of that may be enjoyable for some of you and maybe for others less so. And I've worked with people in both categories who just dread having to do things virtually. And the opposite. So let's have a quick look. Getting familiar with the technology. This is the first time I've been on GoToMeet. I work with Zoom and WebEx quite a lot, so I'm well aware. I may be missing some of the things you're putting in chat or missing some obvious opportunities for interaction. It is surprising how many people will go to an interview and not know too much about how they're going to join the meeting or how they can check their audio. We've heard all kinds of horror stories where it's taken 20 minutes to get in smoothly, not necessarily the fault of the interviewee, I might say. So really feeling confident that you can get in smoothly, you can be audible, you know, you're presenting well on webcam, very important. Do try and practice on the platform if you can. If you can obviously get a free version of it, just see how you come across. Get a friend to work with you if you want to get some webcam practice. Just knowing how it's going to work, how you can get on smoothly, making sure you've got the time, all those basics, really, really important. Okay. And I'm sorry, just John's made a comment there. Thank you. Can you ask for feedback from the interview if you don't get the job? Yeah, just drawing attention to that. So John says, yes, you generally get it anyway, but you can ask for it additionally. All right, great. So yeah, structure and clarity. As I mentioned earlier, you know, when you're working virtually, you need to have a bit of structure around you, even more than in the face-to-face setting. It's all too easy to kind of lose track of where we are. So do take time to reflect and do ask for feedback. You know, have I answered your question? You know, I'm just wanted to check in with you. That gives you the information you need. We can't really do that for every answer, to be honest, but sometimes if you're not sure whether you've really got to grips with it, it's fair enough to ask that once. You know, does that answer your question fully? I mentioned the acronyms. yeah, the eye contact bit. When you have everyone on webcam, I suspect that doesn't happen very much in these interviews. It really is difficult. You want to be inclusive, but you do need to focus on the person who's speaking to you. So, but making sure you don't focus on one person exclusively. Again, it can happen when we're feeling nervous. Just make sure you've got everyone in your sights, that you're looking friendly and relaxed. And that last point again, never read from a script. I'm trying not to read from my slides now. I'm kind of well aware, you know, it's not the most compelling way to do it. So just have it in your mind. It really does work better. You don't want to be looking down or kind of staring up there. Just about looking for eye contact. Really good. A little bit on webcam presence. If you can seem relaxed and grounded, even if you're feeling nervous, it really does help. It matters as much as almost anything. I mean, having the information there and being prepared, of course, but just looking as though you're at your ease. You're a human being, of course, you're friendly, you know, you want this job and you want people to like you. Those points really do matter from the beginning, in the way that they would in a face-to-face interview. Just look friendly and engaged. The point I've just made there, 1/3, 2/3, point two there, there's this idea that if we sit slightly to the edge of the screen either way, it looks a bit more compelling. And you'll see when people interview, news interviewers, for example, tend to do that. It may be that if you're sitting right I'm not sure if I am now, but if you're sitting right in the middle of the screen, it can look a bit more confrontational. Maybe a small point, something to bear in mind, so that you've got a little bit of space just to kind of engage people in, slightly more, I don't know how to put it, less full-on way, shall we say. Maybe that's a bit of a detail, but something to think about. Yeah, being aware you're on webcam. Of course, we can forget that. And so, the hands flying in front of the screen or leaning right forward to get something, we really don't want to do that. Just kind of keeping that very basic etiquette in mind. Just a couple of other points, and then I will leave you with it. But there is something about working virtually where people can forget what we do well in the face-to-face setting, our particular strengths in communication, convey even more powerfully in the virtual space, and what we tend to do less well also. So it's worth us keeping an eye on that. If you are someone who, I don't know, whose hands fly everywhere, or you have a very quiet voice, really, really tune into it and see what you can do before the interview, because it does come across more powerfully in the virtual setting. Okay, and finally, I think I've made this point already, just we are, wanting to engage with people. So sometimes in virtual meetings, it can feel a little bit unreal. That point about just being friendly and saying hello and thanking people and so on, the absolute obvious basics, sometimes get forgotten in virtual space. So please do remember you're talking to human beings, not a computer, or both. That's me done. And somebody's asked, how long do the interviews last roughly? John, I think you can probably answer better than me on that. I think it's a fairly kind of, how long is a piece of string? But do you want to answer on that one?
So in the interviews that we conducted recently, we gave an hour between candidates. Not that we expected the interview to last an hour, we expected it to last about 45 minutes. And then that way we had 15 minutes for a bit of a debrief. But if the candidate had a lot to say or the interview overran for some reason, then yeah, there was adequate time. I can take the next question as well. Is it different for a locum job versus a substantive job? And I think that there are lots of things that are different there. So I mentioned about the prep beforehand. So I would still recommend that you go to the trust and you meet one of the clinical leads. So you'd still need to do that. But the interview panel will be nowhere near as vast. So you won't need to meet kind of the associate medical director or the chief exec. You won't need to do any of that. Generally in a locum job, it's just going to be a couple of the clinicians and somebody from HR who'll be in the interview. So the panel will be a lot smaller. There isn't the need for a presentation either. So there is a huge difference in what it feels like to do a locum versus a substantive job. Yeah, there'll be quite a few differences. I hope that answers that. The length of the interview there is probably going to be about the same because they still need to assess similar things, but it does feel a little bit more informal. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still a formal process, but when you go to a substantive interview, you will realize that is a very formal process.
Thank you. And I've just seen a question from Mark to both of us. What are the most common mistakes that you see interviewees making? And another question after that. So, John, would you like to?
Common mistakes. So I don't think there are common mistakes. I think it is very obvious when an answer is a weak answer, especially when you compare it to the other people who you are answering those questions. If you give an example and your example isn't so relevant, or you haven't really flipped it round to turn it into the positive, then the answer comes across as a little bit weak. Make sure that if you're going for an interview about respiratory, you don't spend all your time talking about what you did in neurology, so make sure that your answers are relevant. Yes, you can bring in something that isn't specific, and if you need to be, say I did this audit and the result of that this happened, but don't keep going back to something that isn't related to that job. Otherwise I'll worry that actually this person wants to be a diabetic doctor and I want them to be an ED, and I'm now worried actually, is this the right person for my job? But I wouldn't let it stop you bringing in good examples, but I would also make sure you keep referencing the type of job that you're going for. Is it important to go through all guidelines of a new trust before interview? No, I think what you need to do, you need to be very much aware of the CQC report, not because you want to say, you failed and you got this and you got that, but so that you understand the direction of travel for that trust, the things that were highlighted as good that you can reference, or the things that were highlighted as bad that you can say, actually, I bring this and this can help you develop this and can help to take the trust forward in that way. I think so. You need to know about their most recent CQC, if they have one, their 5-year strategy, their 10-year strategy, where does that trust want to be? But also to understand what that trust's values are, because I think that's something to say, yes, I've done my research about the trust, I know a little bit more about you.
Thank you. Great. And I mean, nothing much to add. I would just say, perhaps on that question about the most common mistakes, is people forget to share their enthusiasm. That's one of the most common, because we can obviously really prepare well, and that's necessary. But I guess a combination of nerves and over preparation sometimes actually makes us less effective. So, and when that happens, what also can happen is that we forget to say, this is, here's my enthusiasm, not just about what I bring, but also a passion to develop this, work in that area, show outcomes here, etc., work with all those things. And that tends to fall by the wayside when we're thinking too much in terms of, I must mention X, Y, and Z. So having said all that I've said about using acronyms, thinking about a virtual presence and so on, also really important to just think about what do you really care about here? Why is this actually appealing for you? Feel that, and that you can bring that to the interview. Would just be my comment on that. Thank you, folks. I don't know if there are any other questions. That is all I was going to say. So
I just wanted to say a huge thank you to both of you from the London School of Peds. I think that was super informative, and I think it gave us an insight that possibly is lacking in our training in some ways in preparing for consultant interviews. I'm ST7 and it's all feeling a little bit daunting. I just want to encourage everyone to fill in some feedback just so we can keep this going, and thank you guys again for your time, because that was really, really brilliant, and those resources are great. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure. Good luck, everyone.